Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to learn about the findings from the recent survey of principals about their perspectives on how social and emotional learning can prepare children and transform schools. Before we begin the program, I'll just review a few quick housekeeping items with you. We will be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll hold a Q&A session at the end. We'll also be answering some of the questions that many of you asked when you registered for the webinar. To ask a question during the presentation, you can type your question into the questions feature in your control panel, and I'll put it into the queue to be answered during the Q&A period. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can use that same questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. The number one technical problem that people run into is often a lag in the audio, and that's generally because the computer bandwidth is not quite keeping up with the slides and the audio and everything else going on. So you always do have the option to call in by phone. You can keep the slides up on the computer through that channel, but you can switch off computer audio and dial in by phone, and oftentimes that results in a better audio connection for you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as the presentation slides, so keep an eye on your email tomorrow for details on how to access those materials. And just one last note before we get into meeting our speakers. When you log off, you will be prompted to take a short survey. It's 5 questions and it takes less than a minute to answer. And we really do appreciate people's feedback on today's program as well as ideas for future webinars. So now let's get started. I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. We are joined by Matthew Atwell and Melissa Schlinger. Matthew has been a member of the civics team since 2015. He conducts data analysis and research on a diverse set of policy areas, including the education gap, civic health, social mobility, and ocean conservation. He has co-authored numerous nationally syndicated civic reports, including Building a Grad Nation, Hidden in Plain Sight, Our Opportunity Nation, and the Great American High School Campaign. He was also the lead author of Civic Deserts, America's Civic Health Challenge. Matt is joined today by Melissa Schlinger, who is Vice President of Practice and Programs for CASEL. Melissa leads CASEL's efforts to advance systemic implementation of evidence-based social and emotional learning in school districts across the nation. She oversees CASEL's Collaborating Districts Initiative, as well as the development of school and district resources based on CDI learnings. As a key member of CASEL's leadership team, Melissa collaborates with many organizations to advance CASEL's mission of making social and emotional learning an integral part of pre-K through 12 education for all students in the nation. Melissa is also a former educator in the Fairfax County, Virginia Public Schools. So I know we have a lot to cover today from the research report, and so I will hand the program over to Melissa to get us started.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I'm going to take just a couple minutes before turning it over to Matt to set some background information about CASEL and about this particular report. And then after Matt, I'll come back on and talk a little bit about the work that CASEL's doing around supporting principals. So we'll start with talking about the important role that principals play. We'll talk about the report, and then we'll also talk about what the future recommendations are for what we can do with this information and where to get resources. Before we get into too much detail, just to make sure everyone is on the same page with who is CASEL. Many of you may know CASEL. We are the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And our mission has been to help make social and emotional learning a part of every child's education pre-K to 12. We do this by advancing the science around SEL with our research team. We also have folks that are focused on policy work at the state and federal level. And then we also have folks in the practice team who are really working to support and learn from what SEL looks like in classrooms, schools, and districts. All of our different departments collaborate with each other and with external partners to advance this mission. As you may know, CASEL actually has commissioned a number of reports over the years. You want to go to the next slide, Emily? And we do this so that we can hear from stakeholders and have a better understanding of what's happening in this movement. And we've clearly seen a huge movement of interest in SEL in recent years. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the different reports that we've commissioned over the years, but I would encourage you to visit our website if you want to hear more about some of the work that we've done to survey teachers, students, and even principals before this report. a quick snapshot from those. Go to the next slide. The missing piece report, which we did quite a few years ago now in 2013, we knew even then that 93% of teachers in 2013 really wanted a greater focus on SEL in schools. Last year, we did a survey of students themselves, both high school students and recent graduates, to hear about their belief in the importance of SEL and how well they currently felt that their schools were helping them be prepared for a job or career. And we did conduct a principals survey a couple of years ago, which you're going to hear Matt refer to when he looks at the change from then to now of principals. And in our principals report, we knew a couple of years ago that overwhelmingly 73% of principals believed students from all types of backgrounds would benefit from SEL even then. So we'll be looking forward to hearing more about that. With respect to just the general research around the principal role, I wanted to just briefly comment on some research that's happened over the years around principals. So we know that whole school improvement is key when the principal is a key figure in that effort. We know that whether or not that change happens and if it is sustained relies on the principal. We also know that principals who fostered positive relationships with teachers improve job satisfaction and staff sense of community and commitment. It was cited as the #1 reason for teachers' decisions about whether or not they would stay in a school was the quality of administrative support. We also know that school leadership is second only to classroom instruction as an influence on classroom learning. Research also tells us that principals have a significant influence on how teachers can rate their sense of empowerment in their school environment, their professional development, and the use of their teacher time. Also, we know that the positive effect of effective principals have on teacher outcomes are even greater in disadvantaged schools. So this is just a quick summary of some of the research that's been done on the role of principals, how they've actually achieved that. If you go to the next slide, Emily, we know that schools that have the highest learning gains had principals who promoted a strong school climate by empowering and coordinating the work of teachers and school staff around shared goals. And we know that transformative school leaders are needed in order to realign structures and relationships as part of a systemic social and emotional learning implementation to achieve genuine and sustainable change. There are a few key things that we know principals can do, and you'll hear more about those later, but leading with a vision and courage is really important. Integrating SEL school-wide into the classroom, the school, and in partnership with family and communities, and implementing with integrity and sustainability. So that's just a quick summary of some of the background research about the key role that we know principals play. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to talk to us about this new report and what we're learning today.
Thanks, Melissa. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Matt Atwell with Civic, and I'll be talking about our new report, Ready to Lead. And it is an update of a previous report. In our first survey of principals in 2017, we found that despite a strong consensus on the importance and value of teaching students social emotional skills, only a small proportion of principals said their school was implementing SEL in a systematic or formalized way. 2 years later, principals in 2019 remain convinced of the importance of SEL, but there are now encouraging signs of progress in the degree to which schools are implementing SEL, and I'll talk more about that later. But first, just a few notes on the methodology. The survey was conducted by our partners over at Heart Research Associates, who we owe a great deal of thanks. Melissa mentioned that there have been 3 previous surveys before this, and we partnered with Heart on all of them, who have actually done the survey work, and we have analyzed the results. It was an online survey of 710 public school principals nationwide, conducted from May 8th to June 28th of this year, and is a nationally representative sample of principals consistent with the 2017 survey that we released with CASEL that was also conducted by Heart. Next slide, please. So the report is broken down into 4 sections, beginning with attitudes on social emotional learning, followed by implementation, barriers to growth, and assessing SEL, and I'll close with a few recommendations looking to the future. Next slide. What we found first and foremost is that SEL continues to be an important focus for school principals, with 98% saying that it is very or fairly important for schools to promote SEL skills as part of students' in-school experience, and over 9 in 10 principals saying their school should place at least a fair amount of emphasis on developing SEL skills. And we see this across school types and locales. Despite the fact that it looks like there's slight backsliding in the percent of principals believing their school should emphasize developing students' SEL skills, we really view this as being consistent with the 2017 numbers. Going into the 2019 survey, we were a little nervous we'd see some backsliding, as it is difficult to see progress as the numbers approach 100%. So the fact that they remain so consistent is indicative of a strong, unwavering consensus among principals that SEL skills are important and should be emphasized in the school day. And with this, large majority of principals still believe that teaching SEL will foster a more positive school climate, believe it will improve academic achievement, and expect the SEL will have long-term benefits even after graduation. Next slide, please. Principals also remain convinced that social and emotional skills are teachable, with 99% of principals saying these skills are probably or definitely teachable. That's what the number should be on that left-hand side graphic, including 71% saying these skills are definitely teachable. Encouragingly, there is a growing belief in the importance of implementing a formal curriculum for teaching social and emotional skills across all types and areas. And this was one of the largest changes we saw compared to the 2017 survey. In 2017, the majority of principals believed that teachers did not need a formal curriculum because they're naturally teaching these skills in the classroom. But now 70% of principals believe this is not the case and that teachers need to be intentionally including SEL into their curriculum, a jump of 27 percentage points in 2 years. As principals recognize the need for formal curricula, there's also been an increase in the percent of schools implementing a separate and specific curriculum for teaching SEL skills. And in addition, one of the largest increases we've seen in school level implementation has come in the availability of coordinated professional development programs. So we see principals redoubling their effort to prepare teachers to develop students' SEL skills by increasing access to both curriculum and professional development. Next slide, please. We've also seen a large increase in principal support for explicitly incorporating SEL into state standards, with 87% now saying they should at least probably be stated. This marks a sizable increase from 73% in 2017, including strong support nearly doubling from 25% to 49% over 2 years. Support has also grown in all geographic corners in the country, showing that there is strong consensus among principals all throughout America for including SEL into state education standards. Next slide. Now I'll talk about how principals are doing in implementing SEL into their school. And again, we saw a great deal of change when we're looking at school level benchmarks. So next slide, please. When asked in a general sense whether their schools are systematically implementing SEL, roughly the same proportion of principals answer in the affirmative now as did 2 years ago. However, when we look at a number of school level implementation benchmarks, we can see strong progress. In particular, there has been increases in the percent of schools with a long-term SEL plan, a clear vision statement that prioritizes SEL, an evidence-based SEL program that they've implemented, and in the percent of schools that have embedded SEL into their learning standards. In addition, for the first time, we found that nearly 7 in 10 principals believe their learning environments are supportive, culturally responsive, and focused on building relationships and community. And that same proportion believe their school discipline practices emphasize repairing harm and building relationships. So again, a lot of encouraging news as it relates to implementation at the school level. Next slide, please. Looking at those 7 benchmarks from the previous slide that have been asked in both 2019 and 2017, there's been a marked increase in the percent of schools meeting multiple benchmarks for SEL implementation, with a 14 percentage point increase in the percent of schools meeting 6 or 7 of those benchmarks, which is tremendous progress in such a short time. Next slide, please. And as discussed in the previous section, principals report increases in the availability of specific SEL curriculums and professional development focused on SEL. With these increases, principals are now more confident that teachers are prepared to teach social emotional learning. 53% of principals reported thinking teachers in their school are fairly or very prepared to teach student SEL skills, up from 45% in 2017. There's still room to grow, especially in small town and rural districts. Just 31% of small town and rural principals believe their teachers are prepared to teach SEL, compared to 67 and 63% in urban and suburban schools, respectively. Next slide, please. Compared to the school level, principals perceive relatively low rates of district level support and implementation. While there has been a slight increase in focus of 7 percentage points from 2017, only 1/3 of principals believe their district places a great deal of emphasis on developing students' social and emotional skills. And 1 in 3 principals say their district does not meet any of the benchmarks listed here, which is very discouraging. Despite the relatively lower levels of district level implementation, principals do report district leaders are providing guidance and support for SEL at higher levels, increasing from 34% in 2017 to 53% today. The survey results also emphasize the important role of district support, as principals in districts that place a high emphasis on SEL report greater levels of success in developing students' social and emotional skills, as well as greater implementation across a host of benchmarks. These findings again point to the important role districts play in school level SEL implementation, as well as the need for additional district level resources and collaborations to support systematic SEL implementation. Next slide. Now I'll talk a little bit about barriers to growth, but even here, I believe there is some encouraging news to take away on the next slide. So despite many of the improvements mentioned earlier, significant barriers to growth do persist in implementing SEL. In 2017, principals identified teachers not having enough time and teachers needing additional training as the 2 largest challenges to teaching SEL in their school, but both have seen a decrease in the past 2 years by 10 and 3 percentage points, respectively, though about 6 in 10 principals still name these 2 items as fairly or very big challenges at their school. In 2019, the largest challenge identified was a lack of reinforcement of SEL skills outside of school, which actually has increased by about 5 percentage points. Principals also flagged lack of funding as a big challenge. Schools with more low-income students are more likely to report significant challenges to implementing SEL. Significantly, schools with more than 80% of low-income students are more likely to cite a lack of reinforcement of SEL skills outside of school, in addition to teachers needing additional training, lack of prioritization at the district level, and teacher turnover as significant challenges. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk to assessment of SEL, and back to some good news, as we've seen a great deal of progress when it comes to principals and schools assessing students' social and emotional learning. In just 2 years, there's been an increase in the belief SEL schools can and should be assessed. 3/4 of principals believe students' development and acquisition of social emotional skills can be accurately measured, a slight increase from 2017. More strikingly, nearly 7 in 10 principals feel students' social emotional skills should be assessed, up 11 percentage points from 58%, which is really great, as that had been lagging pretty significantly behind. But now it's almost even with the percent that believe that these skills can be assessed. Next slide, please. There has also been an increase in the use of SEL assessments overall, and a larger increase in using SEL assessments with all students. 83% of principals are currently using some type of assessment for students' social emotional skills, up from 77% in 2017. And this increase was seen in a variety of assessment types as well, including use of performance measures, student self-reports, and in administrative records. Importantly, there was a 16 percentage point jump in the percent of schools assessing SEL skills universally with all of their students. This is highly encouraging, as it illustrates that educators increasingly understand that social emotional learning is for all students and not just a means to flag those in need of intervention or to address behavioral or disciplinary problems. Next slide, please. In addition, nearly 2 in 3 principals report that they use school level data to ensure equity in social emotional learning. This is highly encouraging as SEL and equity integrated practices can help close opportunity and equity gaps that we see in schools. Next slide, please. And I'll close with some policy recommendations from the report, looking forward on how school leaders can be supported, and Melissa will add some more context to that as well. Next slide. The first policy recommendation from the report is to create and articulate a clear vision of students' comprehensive development, including SEL. Many states and districts already have mission or vision statements, but now is the time to revisit these statements with greater knowledge of how learning happens, and the SEL is a critical piece to a child's education. Melissa talked about some of the evidence of the importance of SEL, but there's been a ton of research that's been a mounting body of evidence that has been released, as well as the work of the National Commission on Social Emotional Academic Development that really showed that social emotional learning is a booster rocket to a lot of academic outcomes. This vision should be informed by what students should be able to do at each age level and be aligned with the best evidence on social emotional skill development. The second recommendation is to promote the development of adult capacity and strengthen SEL training among teachers and administrators. When asked what the 2 or 3 most important factors to ensuring schools' successful development of students' SEL skills, most principals identified the need for additional professional development for teachers, even as its availability has increased, indicating the need to further embed SEL into pre and in-service educator development programs for teaching SEL skills. The third recommendation is to foster and support continuous improvement of learning environments. To do this, state and district leaders must support the creation and adoption of data systems to continually improve learning environments for all students. It is also essential that policies and resources are aligned to provide equitable access to high quality learning environments for each and every student. Fourth is to support state SEL standards and competency benchmarks backed by funding and resources for systematic implementation. We saw earlier that principals are increasingly calling for this. State SEL standards can also be used as a high impact lever to implement the other policy recommendations included here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Melissa.
Great, thanks, Matt. Based on the questions that we received in advance of the webinar, I wanted to take a minute to make sure that those of you who are listening know about resources that are available on how to actually implement SEL. As you may be familiar, CASEL has a systemic model for SEL that you see up here on the screen. I'm not going to get into the details of what the different competencies are. I hope that most of you are familiar with those, and if not, there's plenty of information on our website. But this model communicates that we are wanting to see schools where SEL is promoted not only in the classroom, and when we say classroom, we mean not only with explicit SEL instruction, but the way in which we're providing academic instruction and the climate, but also that there's opportunities to promote SEL throughout the school building in partnership with families and with communities. So we've had this model for quite some time, albeit the model is somewhat abstract. In recent years, we've also put forth a model, can you advance the slides, please, Emily? Our 10 indicators of school-wide SEL. So that when we say we're looking at a systemic approach, we're basically saying within a school, these are the things that you would see when SEL is promoted systemically. That you would see not only explicit SEL instruction, you would see academic instruction that is designed so that SEL competence is promoted throughout that time. You would see genuine opportunities for youth's voice to be heard and to be valued throughout the classroom and the school. You would see a supportive and positive classroom and school climate. There would be attention to adults' own social, emotional, and cultural competence. You would see a discipline policy that is restorative and focused on promoting social and emotional competence as opposed to punitive and/or exclusionary. You would see a continuum of integrated supports so that students that need more than universal implementation of SEL would also have access to additional supports. You would see authentic family partnerships where we're truly partnering with families on how we can promote the social, emotional, and academic development of our students. We would see connections with community partners towards common mission and shared language around promoting SEL, and always looking at our data to support systems for continuous improvement. So this outlines CASEL's sort of description of what this looks like throughout a school building when SEL is promoted systemically. This is actually part of a larger model. So if you want to advance the slides, that I'm going to share with you. Matt mentioned briefly there's decades of research on the benefits of SEL that we're not going to spend time on this webinar getting into, but this is just a quick summary. We know that there are really important short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes that SEL has shown impacts on, everything from improved attitudes about ourselves and others to fewer conduct problems, less emotional distress, to improved mental health, better relationships, engaged citizenship. So CASEL's model, we focus on these outcomes that we're striving for. You can click forward. So that's the reason that we're doing this. What we're promoting and where we're promoting it is what we just talked about. So we're promoting these competencies throughout our classrooms, schools, homes, and communities. And how we're doing that, if you can please click, is through our district and school framework. You'll notice that our district and school framework, which actually also mirrors our state framework, breaks into 4 sections, which actually very closely align with the policy recommendations that Matt outlined. The first one is about how do you build a foundational support and develop a plan. So a lot of the questions that we saw were, how do I get started? How do I get buy-in? How do we share information about what this is and why it's important? Everything, all those really critical pieces, how do we set a vision and take advantage of the work we've already done to build upon that? All of that's included when we talk about building foundational support and planning. The second area in our framework is about strengthening the adults' own SEL competencies and their capacity. So here's where you'll see professional learning and helping adults address their own cultural competence, their own social and emotional competence, their opportunities to build connections with each other. The third one has to do with specific evidence-based practices and programs that promote SEL for students. And here's where we talk about the importance of establishing guidelines and standards for SEL so we know what kids should know and be able to do at different ages, and how do we actually help students to improve social and emotional competence through both explicit and integrated instruction, as well as climate, culture, discipline policy. And then lastly, how do we constantly examine this work for continuous improvement? So the policy recommendations that Matthew mentioned are very aligned to CASEL's framework. Next slide, please.
I'm going to go ahead and hand over to you, Melissa. Sorry for not doing that sooner.
That's okay. So I'm going to actually just navigate. CASEL has a number of resources that can help schools and districts to advance their social and emotional learning implementation. I want to highlight this one since we're focused on principles today. This is CASEL's Guide to School-Wide SEL. It's an online resource. You can also download a printable version of it. It's located at schoolguide.casel.org. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this resource, but I did want to give you just a brief overview of what you'll find here, because many of the questions that were submitted, the answers lie in this resource. So you can start with how it works, which basically, this is just the homepage, but it kind of shows you a little bit about how we define school-wide SEL, what is SEL, and a little bit about the guide. But the how it works page is really where you start to see the way in which we break down the implementation process so that schools can achieve all 10 of those indicators. So down here, you can see this first section where we're organizing is how we build awareness, commitment, and ownership and create a plan. The second stage is about how we are focusing on adults and promoting SEL for students. And the third section is about how we are helping schools think through their continuous improvement cycles. So just to show you a brief indication of what you'd find here, when you click on this, at the very beginning, people say, how do I get started? I'd recommend you get started with Focus Area 1A, and this will give you information on how to build awareness, commitment, and ownership within your school. The big buckets of work in this section are creating an SEL team, which has diverse representation, doing some initial foundational learning for your team and for the school community, and developing a shared vision. I'm going to click on this just so you can see the kinds of resources that you would find here. The shared vision will show you information about why the shared vision is important and some important elements to think about. There's some examples of shared visions, and importantly, at the bottom, you can actually download tools that will help you and your school community develop that shared vision. So it goes through very in detail, step by step, on how to get stakeholders, who's part of that group, and how to engage them in a conversation together. And then it has a lot of information about a process for developing a shared vision. That's just one example of many resources that are available on this. And this is, again, just Focus Area 1A. In Focus Area 1B, that's when you take everything you've done so far and start turning that into a plan for how you'll promote SEL. In the Focus Area 2 and 3, here's where you'll see information about how to strengthen adult SEL, and that will be broken into how to help them develop their own SEL competence, how to help them create structures for collaborating and developing relationships together, and also some intentional work on modeling SEL. And then for Focus Area 3, here's where you'll find resources to help you think through your plans for promoting SEL for students. And when we talk about doing that for students, we'll be looking at what you do in the school, what you do in the classroom, what you do with families, and what you do with community partners. So it's a pretty comprehensive resource that you should be aware of. Focus Area 4 helps you put together a plan for continuous improvement. Also up here on the top, you'll see that there's ways to track your progress. Sometimes people say, how do I take stock in the work we're already doing so we can build on that? This is a great way to do that by starting with CASEL's rubric. This is a 30-item assessment. You can take all of it at once, or you can take it in sections to see how are we currently doing on building awareness, commitment, and ownership? How are we currently doing on our planning? What have we done for adult SEL? What have we done for students? And how are we doing with continuous improvements? You can take each individual section, or you can do it all at once. There are other ways to assess your implementation that are here. There's a downloadable walkthrough protocol, which would help you look for observable evidence that SEL is happening in a school. And then there's also a survey you can give to your staff in the building. It's also got items that you might consider incorporating into surveys for parents and for students themselves and community partners. There's lots of resources here on the CASEL Guide to School-Wide SEL that I wanted to make sure that, given the nature of so many questions about getting started and how to actually engage in this process, you knew that these resources were here. Again, these are very aligned to the recommendations that Matt mentioned. He mentioned these four: creating and articulating a clear vision, which I showed you that there's a whole section on creating that shared vision. He mentioned promoting the development of adult capacity. There's a whole section on strengthening adult SEL. He also mentioned fostering and supporting continuous improvement, which you can find there. And he mentioned also supporting state SEL standards and competency benchmarks. There is a place on CASEL's website where you can get resources about state level work if we have state level folks on here. And there's also information in our district and school resources on how to align academic objectives with SEL standards. So this webinar doesn't give us enough time to go into each of these resources, but I want to make sure everyone on this webinar is aware of 6 key places that you may want to follow up with, and we'll be sharing these slides with you. I just showed you this one here, the schoolwide guide to SEL. But if you are at a district level and you're interested, and we are very interested in how do districts create the conditions where school-wide SEL can take place, we recommend that you start at the SEL District Resource Center. We heard from Matt that a lot of principals don't feel like they have the support of the district to do this work. The SEL District Resource Center follows the same 4 main categories, meaning what do we do at the district level to build some foundational support and planning? What should we be doing at the district level to support adults? How should we be thinking about supporting student SEL competence at the district level? And how do we do continuous improvement? That's all found at our SEL District Resource Center. And there you'll find artifacts from the districts with whom we partner, as well as resources to collaborators around the country. Over here, you'll see we also have a state resource center, which was generated by the resources created in CASEL's Collaborating States initiative. We're currently partnering with 30 states and Puerto Rico to help states work with each other to think through ways they can create the conditions where districts can be successful with SEL. And our state resource center provides resources from those collaborations there. If you had questions about assessment, it was interesting to see in the report that more and more principals are recognizing the important role of assessment, and also that it's important to assess all students, that we shouldn't be thinking about assessment as something that we just do for students for whom we have concerns. You can get information about the different SEL assessments that are available and how you might prioritize which one you want to choose. This is all available, and all these resources are free on our website in the SEL assessment guide. You'll also see guidance for how we would recommend you consider SEL assessment. CASEL does recommend SEL assessment be used for formative use, not for high stakes accountability. And you can read more about that in the SEL assessment guide. The next resource is our program review. There were a number of questions saying, hey, what programs do you recommend? What's the best program out there? The program review, you can think of it like a consumer reports to the programs that are out there that have a strong evidence base. There's 2 different versions, one's for elementary and one's for middle and high school. And you can click through to see which programs address competencies in which ways. You can see descriptions of those programs and get a good sense of which ones might be a good fit for you and for your priorities, and also some guidance on how to even go through a process of selecting a program. And then lastly, the SEL Starts at Home resources, which is really about how you can, as a school or district, engage with families and provide resources for families directly. There's information there, both available in English and Spanish, videos that families can see, both in English and Spanish, on what SEL is. So those are some important resources for you all to be aware of. So with that, I want to take it over to our question and answer period, and I will turn it over to Emily for that.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, for that quick tour of the vast number of resources that CASEL does have available. And we do have some questions that came in specifically about those resources, so we'll get to those. And then thank you, Matt, for taking us through the research, and we've got some questions around that as well. So we'll get started. Just one note before we do. everyone, just as a reminder, you will get a link to the recording and the PowerPoint deck. That'll come by email tomorrow. So just keep an eye out for that in your inbox. All right, so Matt, when you were talking about the assessments, the perceptions about SEL assessments and usage of them, we had quite a few questions come in. We also had some questions come in ahead of the webinar around that. So I'm kind of going to lump a couple of them together and you can sort of pull them apart. So one question that came in is, did you ask or find out from the survey where these assessments are coming from? Are they being made by teachers, the district, private companies, or the states? And also another question that came in was just around the concerns about the validity of assessments and if there was any information in the survey gathered about that.
I wouldn't say that there was information gathered on where they're taking assessments from. We did gather information on the types of assessments that are being used. And most typically, principals are using behavioral observations in normal classroom settings or administrative records on disciplinary actions. But we have seen large increases in the use of student self-reports. That was up 10 percentage points, and the use of performance assessments on a specific task or problem. As for the use of assessments and some concern around the use of assessments, while the use of assessments has become more prevalent, there remains skepticism, including with principals, and you can see that in just 45% of principals believing that current assessments to be useful. And while this does represent an increase of 17 percentage points from 2017, it also points to their skepticism around current assessments. And in addition, there remains concern about assessment data being misused by labeling students inappropriately or incorrectly. And this is, I think, why it's so important that educators, including teachers and principals, are trained on how to appropriately assess students' SEL skills, and then also how to use the data from those assessments. And the last thing that I would add is we saw that a lot of principals, when they're asked if they had reliable assessments available to them, how would they use them? And in huge numbers, they said that reliable SEL assessments would be important to identifying students in need of intervention, but also that would be great for just evaluating their SEL programs and for sharing data with parents, improving teacher instruction. So they believe the SEL assessments could be really useful, but we just need to do a little bit more work to make principals believe in the data that comes from those assessments and that they are valid.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. So switching to Melissa and some of the content you went over, in the systemic SEL model that you shared, can you explain a little bit further how you see explicit SEL structure instruction differing from SEL integrated with academic instruction?
Sure. So we know from research that it's critical to do both. And in fact, a lot of times we hear people saying one or the other, and we really feel strongly that both are key. When we talk about explicit SEL instruction, here we're talking about dedicated time and opportunities where the explicit goal of what you're doing during that time is to promote social and emotional competence. So you can imagine a lesson on strategies for managing stress, or a lesson on strategies for being an effective team member, or on disagreeing without being disagreeable, or the kinds of things where really you're doing a lesson on these important social and emotional competence. That's different than when you're providing academic instruction that is delivered in such a way that kids have opportunities to then practice those particular competencies through the lesson. So for example, are there ways that kids can practice working in collaborative structures like teaming as part of their learning, as opposed to having students doing all sorts of independent work only? Or are there ways that students can be engaging in productive discussion around differing points of view, or taking the perspective of different characters in a novel, or thinking through the ways in which different periods could be periods of history or events in history could be interpreted by different folks. So really trying to give the content, but through the content, creating opportunities for those social emotional competencies to be promoted. And we have a lot of resources on CASEL's School Guide for some strategies on how to do that, including some checklists to know, have I done this? And opportunities for kids to reflect and really think through different perspectives and their own views on how things went. Also in thinking about, like, are we giving kids an opportunity to use their voice, to actually give feedback to the teacher about how a lesson went? So there's different ways that you can provide instruction that gives kids opportunities to promote their SEL. And then there's also specific times during the day where we'd recommend you focus on promoting SEL in and of itself, that lesson.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. Some specifics about some of the resources you went through. Are any of these available in Spanish?
That's a great question, and one that I've recently gotten quite a bit. The resources are not available in Spanish to the extent that they are sort of professional facing resources. The only resources that are available in Spanish right now are the resources that we also have that are for parent facing resources. We have had a number of folks ask this question, especially as you may know, SEL is really a global movement, and many Spanish-speaking countries are interested in accessing resources. So it's something that we are aware of the interest in, but right now the only Spanish translations have been done for parent-facing resources.
Okay. That's good to know, and I'm sure you'll continue to evolve all of those resources. Are those resources applicable to a pre-K environment, or is it just K-12?
Yes, I mean, we really think of our elementary approach as pre-K, beginning in pre-K, and it really depends more on the way in which you're structuring your pre-K and how it fits within a school or pre-K center. These resources this is not there's not a program or a curriculum, right? This is about how do we organize our educational environment and systems to support a systemic approach. If you go to CASEL's program review, and I actually will make sure here. So the CASEL program review, which is here, in the elementary version of that, you'll see which programs are appropriate for pre-K, and that's where you'll find actual curriculum that you can purchase or implement.
Okay, great. Yeah, and that's a good slide to stay on, because I think we've had someone ask a question about parent resources, and there's the SEL Starts at Home link. So that is handy for folks to digest a little bit while you're on that slide. I know this survey was specific around principals and school leaders in particular. And was there anything included just about perceptions, and this, we touched on this earlier, regarding the use of specific SEL curriculum versus integrating it into the core curriculum? This particular person asked about admin and teacher perceptions around that.
This particular survey didn't, but I would, and it's a little bit dated now, but I would point to the 2013 teachers survey that had results on teacher perspectives. Also in 2017, we talked with administrators that were not just principals as well, in some larger interview formats, so you get a flavor of that as well. I would also say that there was a recent survey that RAND conducted that gauged teacher and principal perspectives, and I think that might hit at a little bit more of what the question is asking.
And I would just add to that too, in the program review guide, the programs that are listed there are not only programs that do explicit SEL instruction. And you can tell when you go to the program review, there's a quick chart that will show you If they also or instead have integration into academics, if they do school-wide climate work. Some programs are very comprehensive and do a number of things. Some of them are focused primarily on explicit instruction. Some are focused primarily on integration with academics. So you can get a nice overview of the different kinds of programs that are available in the program review guide if you are looking for support for how to do explicit or integrated SEL.
Yeah, I think we could all spend a lot of hours in these resources finding things to help us. So that's great. Matt, did you see any differences in terms of perceptions based on geography? We had a question come in about that, and then one from someone else asking about recommendations specifically to help rural principals become more concerned about SEL. So was there greater acceptance of SEL in particular geographic areas or not?
Geographically, I would say it was all pretty consistent, with a slight exception to the Northeast, where we saw principals in the Northeast are more excited and buying into SEL a little bit more, but again, across the country, it was relatively consistent. The one exception is that across kind of most of the indicators, rural and small towns really lag behind, unfortunately. And that's especially unfortunate because we see that rural and small town principals believe in SEL and the benefits of SEL at similar proportions to their urban and suburban counterparts. But then when you look at implementation, the gaps are pretty significant. So they continue to lag behind. I don't know this for certain, but we do see that higher levels of small town and rural principals flag the need for additional funding streams to support SEL. So I do think that part of the problem is just capacity and really the resources to implement SEL. So I would say that that's probably one of the most significant barriers. But I don't think I really have recommendations for rural or small town areas specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say for, I think it is hard when districts are in more remote areas, and that's one of the reasons that we're also working closely with state departments of education to help think through how to support rural districts. But I think, you know, if there are folks on the phone that are supporting or who work in rural districts, I'm hopeful that even knowing that these resources are available can be helpful, given that they're all free. And while, you know, it can be helpful to get trained on these things, they're actually everything that we've learned from the research and from working with schools and districts on how to navigate obstacles and how to think through systemic SEL is available to be consumed on these free resources. So we're hopeful that by providing these for free and online and available, that we're able to reach many more districts than the ones we're able to work directly with.
Yeah, it's definitely, again, an invaluable resource, and certainly would get some districts who may have less funding for this a good way down the road with getting started. So that's great. Melissa, do you have any recommendations or could point towards some resources from CASEL about what skills, knowledge, and dispositions would be necessary for teachers to have to practice SEL with their students? Basically, you know, what kind of SEL competencies do teachers need? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to jump back into the school guide. I mean, the competencies that teachers and adults, not just teachers, but adults, meaning all of us, you know, both those that work directly with kids and those that don't, the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, the principal, the central office staff, the adult SEL competencies mirror the students' SEL competencies that are needed. So if I were to go back into my school guide and look at strengthening adult SEL, here's where I would find kind of the main areas that that we think about on adult SEL. I will say there's less research on adult SEL than there is on promoting students SEL, because I believe it's become very apparent in recent years that adult SEL is critically important, and the research is catching up with that as well. But we do know that there are some really important benefits to supporting adults' own cultivation of their SEL. So this section's broken into how do they develop their own SEL, how do they collaborate and develop a community of trust, and how do they model. I'm going to jump into the Learn section. So that you can just see some of the resources that are here. Here's a summary of some of the research on why we would want to promote adult SEL. And then here's some of the items that we consider on the rubric around SEL. And then I'm just going to kind of go down here to some of the resources that you can see. So one of the most popular resources is this one here, Reflecting on Personal SEL Skills. And this one here, before I jump into it, you can see these other ones are great too. Brain-based model for workplace collaboration, examining biases for cultural competence, growth mindset for staff, self-care and re-energizing, personalized professional learning plans for SEL. But this section actually is one of our more popular sections. It's a personal reflection for adults to think through their own SEL. It downloads into a Word document. Again, all of this is free, and then here's some instructions on how to facilitate a conversation. But we've found even just this self-reflection on how we ourselves are, how confident we feel in our own self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. This reflection tool can be really helpful as you think through areas of strength and areas for growth, and think about what are strategies that can help with that. So I would definitely encourage you to explore this section of the school guide and some of the resources that are here. There are some providers that provide professional learning specifically around adult SEL. Not as many as provided for students, but we're seeing more and more folks who are prioritizing that.
Thank you. Is there a way to know if your state is already working with CASEL? You had mentioned 30 states, and this person wanted to find out if their state is one that you're working with.
So I don't know if we have a state list. Some of the states are, they promote their collaboration with the other states and CASEL on their own websites. Some of them do not. But if you want to send a follow-up email, you can get in touch with us and we'll let you know if your state is one of them. But I just opened the CSI Resources. This is the Collaborating States Initiative, where you can see information that has been garnered from states on the things that they're doing, and you can see specific resources from different states that are in here as well. But it looks like we don't actually have a list of which states there are, right, at least on this homepage.
Okay, but again, lots of great information there, and states sharing information with others, which leads to this next and final question, since we're running out of time. But are there any associations or professional convenings that you know of that bring together principals to learn from each other on promoting SEL?
That is a great question, and many of you may know that CASEL just hosted our first international conference earlier this month in the beginning of October that brought together 1,500 people that were school-based, district-based researchers, policymakers, funders around SEL. We have also had some collaborations with agencies that support different groups. In fact, I recently participated in a webinar with NAESP, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, and we are in conversations with additional with them about additional ways that we may partner with them to bring social and emotional learning directly to principals. And what I understand from my conversations with NAESP, it is the #1 topic that they are requesting support about. So we're excited about a potential partnership with them. There are a number of universities that are beginning to think about SEL as it relates to principal training. I don't know that we have a list of them, but I've certainly become more and more aware of SEL making its way into principal training and principal programming. But if you are a member of NAESP or NASSP, I would definitely get in touch with them to inquire about how to bring together principals and learn more about SEL.
Thank you so much, Melissa. As always, you have so much information to share with us. And Matt, your review of the survey was so informative, and I know it's going to prompt me to dig deeper into the survey results. And we will include a link to access the full survey report in the follow-up email that you all will get tomorrow. That'll also include the link to the recording and to the PowerPoint deck. I know many of you have asked questions about getting those materials, so they will be on your way to you tomorrow. And thank you, Matt and Melissa, again for joining us. Thanks to CASEL for hosting this webinar, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. Please do take just a second when you log off from the webinar to answer our quick survey. There's also the opportunity for you to provide recommendations for additional topics for webinars. So if there's specific questions and topics that you're interested in, let us know, and we'll certainly take that into consideration as we plan future webinars. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.